"We're moving in Monday." My sister grinned, her eyes sparkling with that infuriating mix of triumph and mischief that had haunted me since childhood. She bounced on the balls of her feet, as if the announcement itself were a private joke at my expense. "Dad already approved," she added, and her words landed like a hammer against my chest. I froze mid-step, my fingers clutching my phone as if it could somehow shield me from the reality settling over the Lakehouse. The hardwood floor beneath me, which I had painstakingly polished last weekend, felt suddenly alien. My sanctuary, the place I had fought tooth and nail to claim as my own, suddenly seemed smaller, intruded upon before anyone had even unpacked a single box. A cold, prickling dread slithered up my spine, curling around my ribs and tightening my chest. "Wait, what?" I whispered, my voice cracking slightly in disbelief, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I lifted my phone instinctively, swiping across the screen to check the notifications from the home security system I had invested in months ago. The moment my thumb brushed the display, a ping echoed sharply through the quiet space. "Motion detected. Trespassing recorded." My pulse jumped violently, a drumbeat of alarm that synced with the sudden tightening in my stomach. My sister had already crossed the first line. She had stepped inside my home without permission. My hands trembled, hovering over the screen as I opened the recorded video. The hallway stretched out before me, empty at first, then a blur of movement as Amber's silhouette appeared, smiling and waving as if she were entitled to be here. The screen flickered, and the reality sank deeper, sharper. My sanctuary, purchased for $515,000 with late nights at my job, careful budgeting, and sacrifices I hadn't even voiced to anyone, was being claimed as shared property by people who had never understood the concept of boundaries. My heartbeat thundered against my ribcage as I replayed the footage, each step she took through my hallway, each casual gesture, each grin, an unspoken declaration of possession. My home smelled faintly of lake air and pine, a scent I had always associated with solitude, comfort, and freedom. Now it felt invaded, like someone had turned a mirror on me and reflected an image of powerlessness I refused to accept. "Nicole?" My mother's voice drifted from the kitchen, deceptively light, almost cheerful, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Don't be so dramatic. We're your family. We thought you'd be happy." Happy? The word ricocheted in my skull, absurd and infuriating. Happy? How could I feel anything but disbelief, betrayal, and a creeping, simmering rage? I lowered my eyes to the phone again. The video showed Amber lingering near the staircase, her sneakers leaving faint scuff marks on my polished floor. She had opened the door to my office and glanced inside, her expression one of mock curiosity, as if she were exploring a museum exhibit rather than violating the home I had labored to make mine. I could feel the shock hardening in my chest, a cold, iron weight that made my fingers clench around the device. My family, my parents who had raised me, whose approval I had once craved, had colluded with her. They had authorized this, given their blessing to a plan that obliterated my autonomy without a moment's discussion. The betrayal wasn't just the trespassing. It was the knowledge that they could smile, genuinely believe, even that this intrusion was reasonable. I took a step back, pressing the phone against my temple, trying to summon the composure that had always defined me. But the footage didn't blur, didn't soften. It played again and again, each frame another puncture in my sense of safety. Every corner of the house, every artifact carefully chosen and placed over years, photos of my parents in their youth, my own trophies and diplomas, small pieces of me encoded into the decor, suddenly felt contaminated. My sister's grin wasn't just irritating. It was an assertion of supremacy, a declaration that my feelings, my rules, my ownership meant nothing. And yet there was another layer, subtler but no less stinging, disbelief. I couldn't comprehend the casualness with which they had justified this, the audacity of it. My mind raced, alternating between arguments I could make and the impossibility of the situation. Could I call the police? Threaten legal action? Confront them outright? All of it seemed surreal, the kind of scenario that belonged in novels or reality TV. Not in the quiet, sunlit lakehouse I had poured so much into. I exhaled slowly, tasting the tension in my throat, the bitter tang of anger that had not yet fully formed but was unmistakable. Amber's shadow on the video lingered in my mind, a symbol of entitlement and invasion. I had always been the careful one, the planner, the person who safeguarded my life and possessions meticulously. And here they were laughing, perhaps they definitely, at the audacity of assuming they had any claim to what I had built. Shock coiled tightly around me, a living thing, relentless and suffocating. I pressed a finger against the video's pause button, staring at the frozen frame of my sister mid-step, her smile arrogant, her eyes alight with triumph. My home, my lake house, my space of peace, had already been breached, and yet in that suspended moment I felt the first flicker of something else. A quiet, simmering determination. Shock had arrived first, uninvited and unwelcome. But it would not last forever. Hatred flared like wildfire, sudden and all-consuming, as I sat back in my dining chair and replayed the morning's events in my mind. The cold, creeping disbelief of yesterday had transformed into something raw, unyielding, a pulse that throbbed at the base of my skull and radiated through my veins. Amber, my sister, the one who had shared my childhood, yet always seemed determined to eclipse me, had orchestrated this with precision, lining up every argument, every smile, every insinuation to convince Mom and Dad that her presence in my lake house was not just acceptable but inevitable. I could almost hear her whispering behind closed doors, rehearsing the phrases that would make them feel justified, righteous even, in commandeering my home. Amber had always coveted my life with an insidious subtlety. She watched me, evaluated me, and cataloged every advantage I had: the late nights at work, the promotions earned through tireless dedication, the meticulous planning that had allowed me to finally afford this house on the lake. She resented my independence, my ability to carve out a life that was unequivocally my own. She envied my career, the steady climb that had made me financially secure, the opportunities she had never pursued with the same discipline. And now she had gone one step further, exploiting the blind trust our parents placed in her to claim what was mine, all under the guise of family togetherness. My parents' complicity cut deeper than Amber's audacity. Their subtle, long-standing digs had never seemed so sharp until this moment. The remarks about my salary, the teasing about how my lifestyle was too fancy to be humble. Their casual mentions that I had enough money to spare. I could now see the undercurrent in their words, thinly veiled greed masquerading as concern, envy wrapped in the language of parental advice. Every memory of their casual judgments, the small corrections, the subtle undermining, now pressed against my mind like a slow, insistent drumbeat. Their approval of Amber's plan wasn't love. It was opportunism, a desire to claim access to what they had long considered out of reach. That evening during dinner, the tension in the air felt almost tangible, thick enough to taste. I had resolved to confront them directly, to assert the one thing that remained entirely mine: my autonomy. I set my fork down with deliberate care, the click against the plate echoing louder than I expected in the stillness of the dining room. My eyes met theirs, steady and unwavering. "You can't just decide to live here," I said, my voice calm but firm, each word weighted with the gravity of the moment. "This is my property, my home, my rules." Mom's eyes narrowed, a familiar flash of condescension surfacing. "Nicole, you're being cruel," she said, her voice deceptively soft, almost maternal. "Family comes first. Isn't that what matters?" I felt the blood surge to my face, my chest tightening with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Cruel? Cruel was sneaking into someone's home uninvited, manipulating a family's authority to claim what isn't yours. Cruel was dismissing years of hard work, hours of sacrifice, and turning a person's sanctuary into a stage for entitlement. Cruel was calling my instinct to protect myself, my property, my peace, my life, an overreaction. The word hung in the air like smoke, cloying and offensive. Hatred coiled tightly in my stomach, sharp and bitter, a living thing that refused to dissipate. I traced the contours of it with my mind, the arrogance of Amber's grin, the smug complicity in my parents' expressions, the casual assumption that my life was theirs to manipulate. Every insult, every dismissal, every sneer from years past crystallized into a single blinding realization. My family had become the enemy of my boundaries. They had weaponized their love, or the illusion of it, to undermine my autonomy, to strip me of the one thing I had built entirely on my own. I clenched my hands under the table, my knuckles whitening, and focused on their faces. Mom's expression was composed, almost rehearsed, but I could see the calculations behind it, the attempt to guilt me into submission, to frame my resistance as moral failing. Dad sat there silently, that same quiet, disapproving air he had perfected over decades, the weight of his approval of Amber's plan pressing down like an invisible fist. The combination of their collusion was suffocating, a perfect storm designed to make me doubt myself, to make me second-guess the very legitimacy of my anger. But I didn't doubt it. Every fiber of my being rejected the notion that I owed them acquiescence. Hatred flowed through me in jagged currents, raw and unrelenting, but it was clarity as much as fury. I understood them, Amber's envy, Mom and Dad's greed. But understanding didn't soften the blow, it sharpened it. I would not let them erase the life I had built. Every smile, every glance, every word they used to try to manipulate me became fuel, igniting a controlled fire that burned behind my eyes. By the end of dinner, I felt the full weight of that hatred, not a mindless self-destructive rage, but a focused, deliberate awareness that I was ready to fight. Amber had plotted, my parents had sanctioned, and yet they had underestimated one thing: I would not be moved. Hatred in this moment was both my weapon and my shield, a fierce clarity that allowed me to see the treachery for what it was and prepared me to respond with the strength my home and my life demanded. By Tuesday, the anger had solidified into a cold, deliberate force, a coiled tension that ran through every nerve ending in my body. Shock and hatred had been the sparks, but now the fire had become precise, controlled, and unyielding. I sat at the dining table, papers spread before me like a battlefield map, reading and rereading the legal documents, property deeds, HOA covenants, and every clause in the mortgage and title agreements. Each line reaffirmed what I already knew in my gut. This house was mine, every inch, every lock, every lake-facing window, legally untouchable by anyone without my consent. My parents' casual approval of Amber's plan wasn't just presumptuous. It was a blatant, audacious violation of boundaries that I had spent years establishing, protecting, and defending. I ran my fingers along the edges of the title document, the ink smudged in one corner from my tense grip, and imagined the satisfaction of enforcing every line of it. My brain churned through contingencies, mental scenarios, and legal maneuvers with the same precision I had once applied to complex analytics projects at work. I was methodical because anger alone wasn't enough. It had to be coupled with action. No one, not Amber, not Mom, not Dad, would set foot in this house against my will. By the afternoon, I had implemented a full security upgrade. Extra locks on every external door, reinforced deadbolts, and a biometric system for the main entry. Cameras were strategically positioned at every approach, with alerts sent directly to my phone. I tested every angle, every sensor, every motion detector until I was satisfied that no intruder could move through my property unseen, unheard, or unchecked. I called my lawyer outlining the intrusion, explaining the premeditation of Amber's attempts, and requesting a preemptive cease and desist letter emphasizing that trespassing by family members would constitute actionable violation of my property rights. The professional calm tone I adopted over the phone was a stark contrast to the heat building in my chest, but it channeled my anger into effectiveness rather than chaos. Wednesday morning arrived with the first test of my defenses. Amber appeared at the driveway, casual as though the entire spectacle of the previous week had been forgotten. She carried 2 boxes, small enough to seem innocuous, but I knew better. The cameras had already tracked her movement, flashing notifications across my phone like a siren. I activated the intercom as I stepped onto the porch, my voice firm, sharp, leaving no room for negotiation or misunderstanding. "You're trespassing. Leave immediately." I watched through the monitor as her smile faltered, hesitation flickering across her face. She had misjudged the situation entirely. I had not only anticipated her moves but had preempted them. My parents' calls came almost immediately afterward, a flurry of accusations and guilt-tripping attempts. "Nicole, you're being heartless," Mom said, her voice strained with folks' concern. "Ungrateful, selfish, cruel," Dad added, the words clumsy but intended to wound. I read the text messages as well, pleas, rationalizations, manipulations, but none of them diminished the clarity of my position. Instead, every insult, every attempt to shame me, fanned the flames of my fury. Each word was a reminder that this was not about family togetherness. This was about control, entitlement, and a long-standing pattern of disregard for my independence. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly as I scrolled through the recordings from the cameras, each frame a testament to my vigilance. Amber's hesitant steps, her repeated glances toward the house as though she expected an invitation, crystallized my understanding of the situation. This wasn't just a desire to visit or help. It was an attempt to assert authority over my life, to normalize a precedent of intrusion. My anger sharpened into clarity. This battle was not merely over a property. It was over respect, over the acknowledgement that my boundaries mattered, that my autonomy was non-negotiable. I spent the remainder of the morning reinforcing that understanding. Doors were double-checked, cameras repositioned for optimal coverage, motion sensors tested at irregular intervals. I drafted emails to the local authorities explaining the preemptive nature of potential trespassing by my family, documenting every interaction, every recorded step, every attempt to justify what could not be justified. My hands, though trembling with rage, moved with meticulous precision, the fury converted into strategy. By the afternoon, the anger had transformed into something almost coldly professional, a righteous indignation that demanded enforcement, not debate. Every phone call I made, every lock I tightened, every frame of footage I archived was a declaration. I would not be undermined. I would not be manipulated, and anyone who thought otherwise would encounter consequences as certain and precise as the locks, the cameras, the legal letters I had prepared. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Lakehouse, I allowed myself a moment to sit back and absorb the scope of what I had accomplished in a single day fueled by anger. The emotion was still raw, surging beneath my skin, but it had been harnessed. I could feel it, coiled and ready, a potent mixture of protection and righteous defiance. The house was no longer merely a home, it was a fortress, and my anger had become both its architect and its guardian. For the first time since Amber's declaration, I felt the power shift. I was no longer a passive target of entitlement and greed. I was the force to be reckoned with, and anyone who underestimated that would soon learn the cost of intrusion. Thursday arrived like a hammer striking steel, and I was done with caution, done with pretense, done with subtle maneuvering. The week had been a relentless escalation, from shock to hatred to anger, and now it was time to bring the entire ordeal to a head. I arranged for a meeting in the living room, seating my parents and Amber across from me, the sunlight streaming through the lake-facing windows casting sharp lines across the hardwood floor, highlighting the distance that had formed between us. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension coil in my chest, the energy of the past days crystallizing into a single clear purpose. Every fiber of my being screamed that I would not allow this to continue, that I would enforce the boundaries I had spent years defining. I sat upright, spine rigid, hands resting lightly on the arms of my chair. My eyes swept across the room, taking in their faces, reading for the slightest flicker of condescension or defiance. Amber shifted in her seat, a hint of pout betraying her attempt to maintain control, but it faltered under my gaze. My parents, so often the arbiters of authority in my life, sat uneasily, trying to gauge my temperament, and perhaps for the first time in years, uncertain of the outcome. The balance of power had shifted, and they could feel it. "This stops now," I said, my voice low but resonant, measured, carrying the weight of inevitability. "My home, my rules. If anyone steps foot here without my permission, it will be legal trespassing. I am not negotiating this." Every syllable was deliberate, precise, leaving no space for misinterpretation. There was no room for debate, no loopholes, no justifications that could absolve them of the fact that they were in the wrong. I could feel the authority in my own tone, the calm ferocity that comes when a person has moved past fury and into unassailable certainty. Amber's pout deepened, an almost childish expression that belied her usual cunning, her usual ability to manipulate those around her. She opened her mouth, presumably to argue, to attempt charm or guile, but I cut her off before she could frame a single sentence. "No, Amber," I said firmly, leaning slightly forward, eyes locking onto hers. "This isn't about your feelings. This is about reality. This is about law. This is about respect." The words struck like a series of deliberate blows, measured yet undeniably forceful, designed to dismantle the entitlement that had underpinned her entire plan. My parents shifted in their seats, the usual composure and confidence slipping from their faces. For once they had no rebuttal, no paternal or maternal wisdom to invoke, no moral high ground to claim. The security footage had been meticulously reviewed, every moment catalogued and time-stamped. Every attempt at entry, every hesitant step caught on camera. I had prepared for this confrontation as I had prepared for a negotiation in a high-stakes boardroom, with evidence, with clarity, and with absolute control over the facts. I could see it in their eyes, the recognition that I was no longer the younger, more pliable daughter. The recognition that the authority they had always wielded over me, subtly or overtly, was no longer operative in this space. The shift was palpable, almost electric, a tangible recalibration of power that hung in the room like charged air. My boundaries were not suggestions, they were imperatives. My home was not a shared resource to be bargained over. It was a fortress of my own making, protected not by whim but by law, by strategy, and by relentless vigilance. I allowed myself a slow, deliberate scan of the room, noting every flinch, every shift, every fraction of hesitation. My heart still pounded, a reminder that the anger and tension of the week had not been wasted, that they had been channeled into something that was simultaneously protective and assertive. My voice softened slightly, though it retained an undercurrent of steel. "I love you both," I said, glancing toward my parents. "But love does not grant entitlement. Respect does. And right now, respect means accepting that this is my home, my sanctuary, and my decision alone." Amber's gaze fell to the floor, a mixture of frustration and reluctant acceptance playing across her features. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line, the attempt to summon familial authority having failed, leaving her exposed. Dad's brow furrowed, but there was a recognition there as well, a grudging acknowledgement that the rules they had attempted to bend so casually were immovable. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of my certainty settle into the room. Every camera, every lock, every legal document had been a declaration of control, but this confrontation was the culmination. I had drawn the line, and it was unambiguous. The flicker of understanding, or perhaps fear, in their eyes confirmed what I already knew. My home was mine, and my boundaries were no longer negotiable. The power I had reclaimed over my own life felt tangible, electrifying, an unspoken promise that anyone who attempted to challenge it would be met with unyielding resolve. For the first time all week, I felt a quiet, controlled satisfaction seep through the layers of anger and tension. The confrontation was not about humiliation or revenge. It was about assertion, about demonstrating that I could protect my life, my property, and my principles. I had faced the challenge directly, and the clarity of my authority hung in the air, solid and undeniable. The line was drawn, the rule established, and the message had been delivered with precision. My home, my rules, non-negotiable. Finally, everyone in the room understood it. By Friday, the calls had stopped. The endless barrage of guilt-tripping, pleading, and entitlement had evaporated into silence. Amber's attempts to assert her presence had migrated to social media, where she posted vague complaints and thinly veiled jabs, each status update a flickering shadow of the confrontation she could not win in person. I didn't check them. There was no point. The noise of her dissatisfaction was irrelevant to the reality I had established. My parents, too, had recalibrated their approach. When they arrived for the family dinner I had invited, the weight of their previous attempts at intrusion was evident in every cautious step, every lowered glance, every carefully measured word. They stayed in the guest house I had built on the property, a modest separate structure designed to provide comfort without compromising my sovereignty, and I could feel the subtle tension as they moved through the space. The unspoken acknowledgement of boundaries hung between us, palpable and undeniable, a testament to the rules I had enforced and the authority I had reclaimed. I walked to the lake as the sun began its slow descent, brushing the water with amber and gold hues. Each step along the stone path was deliberate, grounding me in the reality I had fought to preserve. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, and the gentle lapping of waves against the shoreline was almost a benediction, a reminder that some things, like this land, this sanctuary, belonged entirely to me. Relief flowed through me first, a soft, warm current that eased the tension in my shoulders, but it was quickly joined by something sharper, more potent, satisfaction. Not smugness, not triumph for its own sake, but the deep, resonant clarity of justice served. I had not only protected my home, I had asserted my independence, reaffirmed my worth, and broadcast my voice in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. I paused at the water's edge, the sunlight glinting across ripples, and allowed myself a moment of reflection. Each step of the past week, the shock, the anger, the meticulous planning, the confrontation, had built to this point. Every lock I had installed, every camera angle adjusted, every legal document reviewed, every measured word I had spoken in that living room confrontation had been part of a deliberate strategy. I hadn't acted on impulse, I had acted on principle, on preparation, on the certainty that my life, my choices, and my space were mine to defend. And now with the evidence recorded, the rules enforced, and their understanding, or perhaps fear, imprinted in their behavior, the equilibrium had shifted decisively in my favor. The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves, a subtle reminder that life moved on beyond this confrontation. I watched the water shimmer and shift, sunlight dancing in unpredictable patterns, and a quiet sense of power settled over me. Not the kind that dominated others, but the kind that affirmed one's right to exist unchallenged within one's own boundaries. I felt untouchable in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with certainty. Certainty in my choices, certainty in my preparation, and certainty in my ability to enforce what was mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't negotiating for respect, approval, or acknowledgement. I was living within the undeniable truth of my authority. I thought of Amber scrolling through her phone, venting frustrations to an audience that could not influence reality. I thought of my parents pacing in the guest house, aware but unable to contest the framework I had imposed. There was a subtle poetry in the arrangement, their presence reduced to respectful observers rather than participants in the life I had built. Every attempt to overstep had been neutralized. Every strategy to manipulate or guilt me had been anticipated and blocked. The boundaries were no longer theoretical, they were physical, legal, and psychologically absolute. I dipped my hand into the cool water, feeling the ripple expand outward, a metaphor of control radiating from me. Satisfaction was not merely in victory over a family confrontation. It was in the reclamation of self. Every anxious glance I had once cast over my shoulder, every doubt about whether I could assert my independence, had been rendered moot. The fight had not been about the house alone. It had been about my voice, my life, and the space to define both without interference. That realization deepened the relief, intensified the satisfaction, and anchored it with the permanence of accomplishment. As the sun touched the horizon and shadows lengthened across the lake, I felt an unshakable calm settle over me. The world beyond this property could continue its chaos, its demands, its intrusions, but within this sanctuary I was sovereign. The justice I had exacted was quiet but absolute, embedded not in spectacle but in enduring consequence. They had tried to claim my life, my home, my space, but I had reclaimed it with precision, resilience, and unwavering determination. And as I stood there, watching the last glimmers of sunlight scatter across the water, I allowed myself a rare, unreserved smile. It was the smile of someone who had faced encroachment, who had fought without compromise, and who had emerged intact, untouchable, and profoundly satisfied.